doing this. So yeah, if you have any issue with that, please let us know, and you can put it on the chat or email us.
So, welcome everyone to our second webinar of this year, and I'm Fiona Ellis from Business Declares, and just reflecting on how much the world has changed in the last few weeks and months, and how we're actually living in very much a planetary health emergency right now. So we really recognise that everyone's going through difficult times, thinking of family and friends, and businesses are struggling, and that this has very far-reaching consequences. So in that context, yes, if we look at the agenda, we've asked Safia Mini to come and join us, as well as having our speakers Amanda and Stephanie. And Safia will just be reflecting on this time, climate action and social justice. And we, as you can see from the poll, we were interested in whether people got how much people have headspace for that, and also the balance between this extremely difficult time and the wider sense of climate and ecological emergency. And so this is our agenda. We're just going to run through over the first 15 minutes or so that introduction, the steps to climate action, which Ellie is going to talk us through. And then I'd be inviting Amanda from Forster Communications. Amanda's the CEO of Forster Communications, to talk about a climate positive plan and all the actions they're taking at the moment. And Stephanie Biden, as a partner from Bates Wells, on how you've engaged people for climate action. So Bates Wells are the first law firm to declare. And we will be doing some questions at the end, so please just put questions into the chat function throughout. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about Business Declares very briefly. So on the next slide, just to think through, we are, as Business Declares, working as a volunteer group of business leaders. We're all passionate about the fact that business has a major part to play in tackling the climate emergency and ecological breakdown, and also in this new context of COVID-19. So our aim has been to accelerate awareness and action, and we launched last September on the day of the climate strikes and had a great launch at the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and then went out with our banners to join the climate strike. And since then we've had up to over 30 organisations have declared with us, and I'm really delighted we're going to hear from 2 of those organisations today about what they've been doing. So very simply, on the next slide, kind of talks about what it means to sign up to declare a climate emergency. It's about really having a plan, getting that plan approved and acting on it, obviously, and accelerating the current trajectory you were already on, which we've seen enormous acceleration in the last year around the net zero targets, and very much also about involving people within the business, involving influencing your stakeholders, influencing suppliers, and advocating for change. So we're a network that's doing that, advocating for change at the moment. We signed an open letter around the planetary emergency, which should be coming out soon, and we're very much wanting to connect people around this. So perhaps I can introduce Safia next and hand over to her for a few minutes. Safia.
Thank you, Fiona. I welcome this morning. It's great to have you on the call. We can't see you, unfortunately, and it's always nice to be able to see people's faces. I got involved with Business Declares in April. I think many of us were deeply inspired by Extinction Rebellion, but we are also in business, and we felt very strongly that business has a huge role to play in redefining both awareness on the need for climate action and also on the implementation. And I just wanted to speak really briefly about COVID-19 and what this means for businesses and for industries. As a practitioner, someone who's built People Tree from scratch 30 years ago in Japan and then the UK and Europe, you know, putting very much people and nature central to everything we do. But I see this as being, well, it's been really interesting. One of the team had suggested that, you know, last week we were in shock. This week we're very much in transition, and next week we'll be getting to grips with the new norm, whatever that might look like. And I found myself naturally picking up the phone to people in Bangladesh and other countries and saying, what's happening to you? Because I think certainly last week I was sensing, you know, a sense of opportunity of the transition that we in the first world, whilst, you know, that of course there is hardship amongst many of our population, that this is also an opportunity where we can stop and think and pause, and we can move forward with space really to look at what matters, and to create some real opportunity around the new economy and the Green New Deal. But what I was hearing from my colleagues in Bangladesh, who work very closely with the labour unions there, is that, you know, we now have 40 million garment factory workers in the majority world who are at risk of losing their jobs, of course, situation of reduced consumption, and are closing down shops and looking after their teams here. But what happens to these garment factory workers who are already living on poverty wages, who were living in incredibly insecure accommodation, who didn't have any savings to go back or to really look at how they build a sustainable livelihood for themselves? And really looking at yesterday at some of the discussions around, should companies actually take responsibility for their supply chains further down? Companies who have made incredibly handsome profits, who haven't paid these people fairly, and now will not look at much else beyond cutting orders and reducing orders. Who takes responsibility for these people? And, you know, how many could we, for example, look alongside private enterprise at global development agencies who are addressing poverty issues and gender issues, taking the responsibility to support these people? You know, the World Bank, IMF, the Asian Development Bank. You know, what support is there for people who are suffering poverty now, and the violence that comes with that, and associated exploitation that becomes all the more because of it. So whilst, you know, I'm very mindful that this creates an opportunity for us who have the privilege to sit back and to take stock and to push forward the new economy and the new thinking and this transition that's so overdue, I'm also very aware that we need to look at social justice within the COVID-19 crisis and calamity. So I just wanted to say finally that, you know, we do have within the principles of fair trade that put nature, people before profit, that look at capacity building, gender equality, that look at something that really go beyond what a minimum wage might look like. You know, we do have, if you like, a nascent movement. Although it's very, very small, we have to look at how we now mainstream business to truly support the planetary health, which will be not just the people equation, but the nature and the climate equation too. So we redeclared a climate emergency last year at People Tree, but I'm just very, very excited to be on the call with all of you and looking to exchange some fantastic ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. That was brilliant to hear your kind of wider view there on these interesting times and big issues, and that kind of, I think it's quite easy to get quite focused and narrow in our heads around sort of what's happening in UK and what's happening in Europe, and it's really interesting to hear about some of the wider conversations that you're having across supply chains. So hi everyone, I'm Ellie Austin, and I'm a sustainability consultant, and I also volunteer with Business Declares. And I was just going to give you all a quick view of some kind of practical steps that you can take in terms of declaring a climate and ecological emergency. So this is a kind of resource that the Business Declares network has put together, and it's something that we will be able to share with all of you after this call. But I'm just going to give you a kind of really quick overview. And this document is basically something that brings together all of the amazing kind of experience and sense of how the kind of practical steps that some of our companies who've declared a climate and ecological emergency have taken. Because there's no kind of one template, and there's no sort of one set way to declare a climate and ecological emergency. And obviously there's a strong sense at the moment that that is going to change as well. And we've all got to adapt and think about how to move forward in this difficult time. So I'm just going to run through the 6 steps that are outlined in the Business Declares document. And some of our speakers later on today are going to focus much more on step 3 and 4. But the first step is about building stakeholder support for declaring a climate and ecological emergency. So this is about really finding people inside and outside of your organisation that will be your allies to help you work out your operational response to this health, economic, climate and ecological emergency. And this is really about kind of building your relationships with, internally with your staff, and then outside of your company with your suppliers and customers, and potentially peer companies as well, to sort of work out how to move forward in these challenging times and to continue to take climate action. The second step is to get board agreement and to declare a climate and ecological emergency. So this is very much about getting your board to make a public statement and to make that public declaration. It's not a kind of one-off thing that you sort of just do and file away internally. Declaring is about very much committing to that public statement, to taking action and to reporting on your progress. And if you look on the Business Declares website, we have a template for a suggested declaration that you can use and adapt. And you can also see examples of all the other companies within the Business Declares network who have made those public declarations. You can see what they say on the website too. Thirdly, the third step is to develop your climate emergency plan. And I know it might feel like kind of emergency overload right now, but this step is very much about putting down on paper your specific aspirations and goals and targets around your climate agenda. And Amanda from Forster Communications is going to give you a lot more detail on their climate positive plan shortly. The fourth step is around engaging your staff. So this is very much about engaging staff on climate action. And I think we're seeing the kind of world of work being turned upside down at the moment. And I think that as we're getting through this time, we're going to see, lots of different ways of working. We need to find ways to skill up staff to keep acting on climate change within their roles and their organisations. And then I think there's kind of big questions around how we can continue to harness some of the behaviour changes that we're seeing at the moment for positive environmental outcomes. And we're going to hear lots more from Stephanie at Bates Wells about how they've been engaging their staff shortly as well. And then the fifth step is to advocate for change outside of your organisation. I think, obviously being part of Business Declares is a really fantastic way to do that. It's about being part of the kind of group of leading companies who are acting on climate change. And there's also lots of other communities like B Corps as well that you can be part of. And the final step is to monitor and embed climate action. So this is about having the kind of the governance structures in place, about making sure that you incentivize staff to make positive decisions for environmental outcomes, and also helping them, think about how to report transparently on progress as well. That's just a really kind of quick overview of the steps to declare document, and we will share that with you after the webinar. And I wanted to also just say there's a couple of other resources that you might find useful. So one is the BLab UK playbook for climate emergencies. There's more detailed case studies in that document as well, separate from the Business Declares one. And quite a lot of companies that have declared with Business Declares are also profiled in that document, so you might find it useful. And we also held a Business Declares webinar about the middle of January, in which you can get the recording on the Business Declares website, and you can hear some of our other companies that have declared talk through their journey, sort of going through these steps as well. Okay, so I'm now going to move us on and hand over to Amanda Powell-Smith from Forster Communications. So Amanda, if you can unmute yourself.
Hello, yes, great, thanks Ellie so much. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, yes, okay, thank you. Great, so good to be here, and just a quick intro. So I'm CEO of Forster Communications. We are a social business, and just our background, Gilly Forster, our founder, was marketing director of The Body Shop. So we have always believed in business as a force for good, and very much constantly pushing ourselves around values of curious minds. Oh, sorry, if you go back one sec, curious minds, collaborative attitudes, and pioneering actions. And it's always about walking the talk for us and reporting on impacts. So yes, next slide, please. So it's not a surprise, therefore, that we became a founding B Corp, and that we have been pushing that forwards on how we can record, how we can track our standards, and how we can, to be honest, how we can do more. I think before we get into the detail of the plan, I just really wanted to pick up on the points that have been raised very eloquently already by Safia and Fiona and Elliot and so in terms of the next slide, it's a question of which emergency are we actually talking about here? And just to note that, right at the moment, we're working very much at the heart of community action. We're seeing how, the impact that this is having on everybody. We're completely all around focusing on COVID-19, so whether that's Neighbourly or Eden Project, etc. And I think when there is a chance to step back from that, it almost reiterates that there's never been a more important time to think about sustainability and almost that basic point around survival. It absolutely starts with our employees and our families and our friends. It includes our neighbours. It spreads out to our colleagues. It crosses the community. It's really essentially our response to everyone across the world. And there's been quite a bit of thinking about, almost dare we talk about climate while this is going on? Is it, should we be too focused? But actually, we need to see the pandemic and the climate emergency as two sides of the same coin. It's completely important that we're not seen to be competing with each other. And it really reiterates, I think, the relevance of the whole Sustainable Development Goal framework. And whether you start with health as your entry in, or whether you start with climate, all these things are fundamentally interlinked and joined up together. So yes, we're focusing on the pandemic at the moment, but that climate action is completely critical and continues to be. And that any climate action that we take place cannot be delivered at the expense of other people's livelihoods. So I think it's this whole balance which is going to be brought more to the forefront now than ever before. Whether it's called social justice or just transition, this is ultimately about people and planet together. So making sure that no one gets left behind. So just to sort of set how we're seeing this as why it's so important to keep thinking. If you don't mind going on, so we declared a climate emergency at the launch of Business Declares, because although, as I say, we had ISO 14001 in place and B Corp standards in place, we recognised that something needed to change, and that we needed to provide more urgency, both for ourselves actually, as well as for our wider contacts and things. So Business Declares was a brilliant opportunity for us to actually to put ourselves under a bit of pressure and to really start having some quite scary and uncomfortable questions about, okay, if we're doing a good job, but are we really doing enough? So just as an anecdote, one of the biggest things that sort of created a reaction in our firm was around whether we should become a vegan employer. And it sounds very small at the moment, you know, and literally it just means things like, you know, offering soy milk instead of cow's milk. And in August last year, 2019, that was voted down by a majority of staff who felt that was an impingement on their choices, and that they could choose to do that, but they shouldn't be forced to do it. Roll on several months, and the publication of our climate positive plan in February this year, that was absolutely seen as the natural thing to do. And yes, so we should definitely do it. And if people wanted to buy their own cow's milk, that's up to them, but the company should take a step forward. And I think it's really just interesting how that, how the transition of people's mindsets and desire to do more and change things happened in actually a very short space of time. So we declared a climate emergency, and then you've got 6 months to put a plan together. So then, you know, there's a lot of thinking about what should we do. And in January, as I say, we published our climate positive plan. Don't mind flicking on Elliot's slide. Our starting point on this, and it picks up, I think someone said at the beginning, this is what we've done for ourselves, and everyone needs, I think, to really think about what their business can offer and do best in order to create the change. So we are a service provider. We have no Scope 1 emissions. We're quite a small business. We've got a small office. It would have been very easy for us to become net zero by offsetting things and doing it quite quickly. So that also, when we really thought about it, that therefore wasn't enough. And our biggest footprint is to our suppliers and our clients and our community, i.e. Scope 3 emissions. And when we thought about what we could do, we realised, you know, obviously our biggest asset is our professional skill base. We're communications, we're behaviour change, we're all about influence and inspiration. So how can we match these things together? And we gave ourselves, I think, the freedom and the liberty to recut the targets, to not think in terms of scopes, because that wasn't the right thing to do, but to think in terms of us and our businesses and our way to do it. And we realised that in order to make a tangible difference and to push ourselves, net zero wasn't enough for us. We needed to become climate positive, and that we needed to put the climate, you know, recognise the whole aspects of the sustainability journey within this. So what does that actually mean? If you don't mind, next slide. What we looked at is how we could absolutely control everything that we had direct influence over, but also how we could reach out beyond our boundaries to inspire wider action. And we want the total impact of our direct and indirect actions to be positive for the environment and to remove damaging emissions from the atmosphere. So on slide 7, sorry, next slide. Yeah, what we've done is thought about this in 3 categories. We thought about ourselves. So what can we do that we are in control of? And we have put suppliers into that. We may be a small business, but we're still a business that purchases from other people. And it is our choice about who we purchase from. So our first goal around this is to absolutely accelerate the process of reducing our own carbon emissions, and to by March 2022, we only want to work with suppliers who are also committed to cutting carbon. We've currently articulated that as achieving net zero, but we might evolve that as it goes on. So that process is starting now. We already screen our suppliers for living wage and modern slavery commitments, and now that's being extended to find out where our suppliers are on the same journey. We've given ourselves time to be able to help and work with them in the belief that everybody should want to be on the same journey. But if it comes to it, then we might need to change who we work with. The next area that we really thought about was our clients, and how can actually, I mean, we're lucky in that the work we do is all around social purpose and social change, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all our clients are looking at every aspect of sustainability. They might be focused on one particular area and not necessarily thinking about their carbon emissions. So how can we inspire and support our clients to tackle the climate emergency? And we have set ourselves a goal that by April 2023, all our clients will have publicly committed to cut their carbon emissions. Now, I have to admit that's created a bit of a reaction from some of our peers across the industry, saying that, you know, they wonder whether that's a wise thing to do. For us, we absolutely think it is a wise thing to do. And so far, we haven't seen conflicts of interest around that, but we have seen quite a few organisations not currently thinking about it, but not currently knowing quite what to do. So again, how we can help them, signpost them in a different way, connect them up with other people. That's all about adding value into that. And then the third area is our communities. And we've defined our communities by looking at our team, where we work, and our industry as a whole. So we are in shared office space, and one of the key things that we've been doing is working with our landlords to not only help them bring what they want to do to life, but really to engage other tenants. And that's been actually very exciting to see how many other organisations in the same thing actually do want to get involved. And some are more sophisticated in what they're thinking about, others are just getting started. But that is again a ripple effect of change that we can really help to create. So so three big areas broken down into smaller targets and things like that. We have a sort of milestones along the next three years. We've published our plan. You can see it. It's on our website. We really want to help and see if we can help others to move forwards, and that's really important. And just a quick summary of what we're looking at the moment. It is, as I said before, all about the supply chain and how we can really understand our emissions within that and how we can help them to move forward. So before we might need to make some decisions about who we work with. I think the finance piece is really important. We do have our pensions are already ethical pensions provided for our staff, but we're just making sure that that's all linked together. And we're looking at the Make My Money Matter campaign and how we might be able to support that in order to encourage other people to stand out and champion the power of finance. And then critically, how we can help our team to really understand their own carbon footprints. And it's a very thin line between we need to encourage and enable, but we can't tell people what to do outside work. This is about giving people choices and access and options on how to choose that. So particularly looking at how we can support their travel options into work and cycling, walking incentives around that area. So that's a sort of snapshot view of what took us obviously a long time to think about and come together and to approach in a way which is right for us as a business. It's a journey. We definitely haven't got everything right. There's definitely things we need to think about. There's a big question around how we measure change, and I'm happy to talk more about what we're doing on that, is that helpful. But fantastic to be here, and always happy to chat if that's ever helpful to anyone. So hand over now to Stephanie from Bates Wells, who'll talk about their own experience. Thank you very much.
Stephanie, sorry, before I hand over to you, I'm just going to jump in and just encourage everyone to use the chat function. So if you have any questions, there's a chat function on the kind of Zoom toolbar. That'll appear on the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen, or maybe on the side of your iPad, whatever you're logging in on. But please feel free to pop questions in the chat box, and then we'll come back and I'll pick those up at the end for both, for all of our speakers. So thank you. So Stephanie, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be able to join you. Despite the illusion that Zoom provides, I'm not at the top of a mountain in the Lake District. And very excited to be joining in my first Zoom webinar. Just a little bit about Bates Wells, we are a law firm. We were the first law firm in the UK to become a B Corp, and we work with thousands of charities and social enterprises, as well as public bodies, startups and household name established businesses, providing them with the full range of legal advice that they may need. And I'm just going to be sharing a bit this morning about seeking to engage both Bates Wells' own people and our wider stakeholders and collaborators in responding to the climate emergency. So a little bit about how we came to the point of making a declaration in connection with the climate and biodiversity crisis. Around about a year ago, we were looking at internally the environmental impact and the initiatives going on within the firm, and thinking about what could we do next to have a meaningful, positive impact, recognizing the growing environmental crisis. And I think just the sense of urgency that came out of the IPCC report in autumn 2018. And something that emerged from those conversations amongst a group of us within the firm was the idea of something which we referred to as meaningful virtue signalling. So recognizing that we were in a situation that was urgent, that we don't have all the answers yet, and we're all learning and finding our way, but we needed to respond in a way that recognized the urgency and where we could be accountable for what we did next. And so the idea of making a declaration in response to the climate emergency came out of that. It was then a very consultative process, and again, perhaps a challenge when you recognize you're in an urgent situation, but seeking to get the full engagement of everyone involved in the firm and avoid some kind of top-down pronouncement, which our people were not really behind and helping to shape. And so out of that report about environmental initiatives, a proposal went first of all to the firm's management board, then to the wider partners. Then there was a consultation with our employee forum group. And finally, we held open town hall style meetings with the whole firm. And all those things contributed to refining the commitments that we were making before we made a public commitment. And one thing that really came out of that significantly was that we sat there and we thought, well, actually, who are we to declare a climate and biodiversity emergency? It's happening whether we declare it or not. And who are we really to make that kind of pronouncement? What matters is how we're responding. And so we decided to, in a very lawyerly way, formally recognise the climate and biodiversity crisis, and then declare what we were planning to do in response to that. And we came up with a series of commitments, which are on the next couple of slides. So firstly, to decrease our carbon emissions and to reach net zero carbon for our scope 1 and scope 2 and some scope 3 emissions in 2019. The challenge there being that some of the scope 3 emissions were very hard to measure, and we're still working on that. So we couldn't make a commitment as to when we might reach net zero on those, because we just were not sure about the challenges of measuring and making a commitment that we might not be able to then reach. Secondly, we committed to taking the climate emergency and biodiversity crisis into account in developing our business strategy. And at the time we were going through a 5-year review of that, so that has fed into how we develop that strategy. Thirdly, recognising that as a law firm, we have long had a culture and a tradition of not just wanting to accept the law as it is, but seeking to use it as a tool for social change, and seeking to develop the law as well, where it maybe isn't supporting the outcomes that we would like to see. And so we committed to continuing to seek to use the law both as it stands and by advocating improvements to advance and support environmental protection. We committed to engaging with all our people in our decision making and encouraging them to live in more environmentally friendly ways. Again, I think, like Amanda, recognising that actually it's not for us to tell them how to live, but we can seek to engage and inspire people, and to collaborate with others to achieve the commitments that we made. And finally, recognising that these commitments are a little open-ended and aspirational, and that we were on the start of a journey, but we wanted to be held accountable to what we did next. We committed to regularly assessing the impact of our activities on the environment and then reporting on how we're implementing the commitments. So some of the things that we did almost immediately coming out of making that declaration, a number of people used a volunteering day to take part in the climate strikes, and some of our people were also engaged with Extinction Rebellion and the lawyers' declaration there, although we did emphasise that as a law firm we have professional duties that mean that we do expect all of our people to act within the law. Internally, we've set up a climate programme board, which is following up and looking to take the next step. So coming out of the town hall, we had a whole load of suggestions from across the firm about things that we could do to follow up on these commitments. And our climate programme board has working groups which look at the 4 different strands of strategy, using the law as a force for good, collaboration, and people and practice. So in the area of people and practice, I guess a lot of this is about how do we internally as a firm walk the talk that we have set and the commitments that we have made. And actually looking over these list of things that we've started to do, I was struck the other day by how many of them seem slightly academic in the world that we now find ourselves in. So questions over bringing milk into the office in glass bottles rather than plastic, and then starting to introduce more oat milk seems slightly irrelevant now that everyone's working from home. Again, we were just looking at the impact of commuting emissions, and now everyone's working from home. I think we may see some big shifts in commuting patterns going forward. And we need to start thinking about how can we engage with our people who are working remotely and help them to start to think about the environmental impact and how to adopt the greenest working practices they can, even while working from home. But these are some of the things that we have done. And again, like Amanda, there is a green purchasing policy as part of our procurement policy, which focuses on, where possible, procuring supplies from B Corps and from the Bi-Social Directory, but also rolling out more environmental criteria as part of our ongoing review of suppliers whenever contracts come up for review. We also have introduced a default vegetarian catering policy, which is trialled in some areas of the firm and is now being rolled out. Again, that seems a little bit academic now that we're all eating 3 meals a day at home. Moving on, we have been working on a number of initiatives around using the law to support environmental protection and to reduce carbon emissions. And amongst those, we have been involved in a charity tribunal case with a coalition of charities, NGOs and faith groups, which has been asking the Charity Commission and the Attorney General to refer questions about trustee investment duties to the charity tribunal. That's looking at trying to help charities that manage significant institutional wealth to think about how their investments support their objects and whether they should be still investing in companies that contribute to a dangerous level of climate change, noting the IPCC's warnings. We've also published, I think as a real conversation piece, a draft bill that would change the duties of company directors so that they're required to promote the purpose of the company and to operate the company in a manner that benefits its members, wider society and the environment. And that would specifically include a requirement to reduce the harm that companies create or impose on wider society and the environment, with a goal of ultimately eliminating such harm. We also held a workshop a few weeks ago where we were looking at trying to bring together different organisations and innovators in the field of biodiversity to think about what should be our legal strategies to address the biodiversity crisis. And we've been looking at building a case for employees' rights, where employees within businesses might wish not to act on or participate in working for certain clients because of the environmental impact of their work. So trying to support individuals' rights to take principled and conscientious action. And we've also been involved in contributing to the Chancery Lane project, which I think is now continuing to work in the new virtual world. Chancery Lane project brings together a number of different law firms and barristers, and they have been carrying out environmental legal hackathons to develop handbooks of suggested model contract clauses and potential legislation, with the aim of basically saying, if you change the precedent, you change the law, you change the system. So it's been great to be able to feed into that. But where are we now in this brave new world of everyone suddenly finding themselves working from home, adjusting to the shocks and the trauma of the last couple of weeks and all the challenges that COVID-19 has thrown up to us? Well, if Ellie, we can move to the next slide. I was out last week just walking on Wimbledon Common, and this is some of the spring blossom that I saw. And I was just reflecting on how I was encountering parts of my locality where I've lived in this area for 16 years, and I was discovering places that I had never seen and developing a new appreciation of the beauty and the nature that was there. And it made me think about how what we have been experiencing in the last few weeks is in some ways a kind of enforced, very traumatic and challenging kind of hard reset of our globalized and in many ways unsustainable lifestyles, and wondering about whether one of the things that might emerge from this situation might be if we could emerge living and working in a way where we're more connected with our local communities and more sustainably. And I think we've seen in the last few weeks how quickly whole societies, whole countries can make huge changes, and recognizing there that there is significant social and personal and economic costs to those changes, but they've been necessary when we've recognized that it's a crisis and that lives are at stake. And that may give us some hope for how we could respond to the climate crisis, again, when we really appreciate what is at stake and we see what we can pull together and do. And so I think one of the questions is, are we going to try to return to business as usual, or focus on sustainability as an angle in how we think about promoting recovery from this crisis? A lot of our people within Bates Wales have also been recognising a theme emerging around intergenerational solidarity and justice. So I think with a lot of the action that we saw last year being led by young people, it's now young people who are making big sacrifices for older generations. That's a bit of a generalisation, but there are some sacrifices being made to protect older generations, and what will be the response to that, and will we recognise responsibility for younger people's future and the duty for whole societies to act collectively. And I think we're also going to see some big changes in how we work, networked working, business travel, and things like that changing and emerging. So these are some of the questions, the conversations, the things we're starting to grapple with amongst colleagues, and the conversations that we're starting to have, and trying to find the hope and the opportunity in the massively challenging circumstances that we now face. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Ellie. I think she has another poll, and very much look forward to continuing the conversation and any questions that you may have, whether in the question session now, or do feel free to get in touch with me afterwards. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephanie and Amanda. It's really fantastic to hear both of your kind of really thoughtful reflections about where we are right now, and everything that you've done to date, and now thinking about how to move forward, and some of those kind of interesting conversations that you're having internally as well. So we're going to move to a question session now. I'm just going to start another poll. So you should see a new poll coming up on your screen, or you might need to find it in the kind of Zoom options bar. There should be a polling function there that you can click on if it hasn't already come up. We've just got a couple of questions for you before we move into the Q&A section for this webinar. We're thinking a lot in our team at the moment about kind of what we can do to best support Business Declare's community. So we'd like to just get some ideas from you on what you'd like to hear about from future webinars. So we've got some ideas there, or if there's anything else that you want to hear that isn't on the list of options in the poll, please put them in the chat and we will definitely consider those. And then we're also thinking about kind of what formats we can use to run these webinars in future. So I'm going to leave that poll in the background, so have a go at voting on that, and then also do feel free to keep popping more questions into the chat section as well for our speakers. So Fiona, do you want to field some of the questions that we've had coming in over the chat?
Yes, we had quite a few questions, and I thought I would invite one or two people to kind of ask their question. It may have evolved. Livy, I was going to see if you wanted to come off mute, because you had a question particularly about building on what Stephanie just said about working from home, but also the question around, I hope you've had some answers to your question around how is this different from a carbon reduction plan. Livy, are you?
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, so I guess I'm working on a carbon reduction policy at the moment for City to Sea, and part of that we're also looking to create a to declare a climate emergency. And so I was just wondering, you know, all these names are sort of buzzwords. I'm also you know, building this into our sustainability plan, which obviously looks at more than just the environment and the carbon impact. So I was just wondering whether it's just, you know, it's semantics of what we call these things. It's a climate emergency plan, it's a carbon reduction plan, it's a sustainability policy. So I just wondered what other people's thoughts are on how you give these things titles.
Well, perhaps come to Amanda, maybe the sense of, I thought you gave some good examples there about how you saw a very much broader, as well as Stephanie with her engagement of staff. So do you want to pick it up first, Amanda?
Okay, great. I mean, I think the key, it doesn't really matter what you call it. It matters that you get it done, is my first instant reaction to it. I think the language around declaring emergency has been an incredibly helpful prompt and tool and a sense of urgency to get people to do more quickly. And that's how we found it very useful. But we've now moved from the emergency to the plan, and that's much more about how we're getting it done. So I suspect that a lot of what you're already talking about having in place is the same deliverables, if you like, about building it up. So I think it's and obviously the climate piece then needs to sit as part of an overall sustainability agenda. So it comes back to that, you know, how everything links together. So I would choose a language which is right for you and your audiences and your you know, the stakeholders, and what's going to encourage them most to take action on sometimes some things that might be quite uncomfortable, and push them forwards, but it's the right language for them.
Yes, and certainly what I've been inspired by in listening to both of you is the sense in which it is wider. I think we would see it as wider than just a net zero pledge in the way you've engaged people, engaged suppliers, engaged clients, and we really do see it as a ripple effect in that sort of sense. So in terms of looking at other questions, I think, Ian, you had a question particularly about whether it should be how accurate or comprehensive it should be. Perhaps we can combine that with thinking about, you know, whether different perspectives like lobbying on legislation change. We have a question there, Stephanie, from Laura. How do we unlock action on climate emergency? Do you want to pick any of those up, Stephanie?
I can try, yeah. So legislative change, I mean, I agree. I think changing legislation can change the framework in a way that has a huge impact. And I think, you know, that's why you see initiatives like the Chancery Lane project have published, you know, an entire publication of suggested legislative changes that could have a huge impact. Bates Wells, as I mentioned, we've worked on this suggestion of how could you amend the Companies Act and change directors' duties so that actually, you know, it's not an optional thing, but actually directors have an obligation as a core part of their role as a company director to be addressing the environmental impact of what their business does. And that takes you beyond you know, a prioritization of shareholder value into making what's sometimes called a triple bottom line approach into the new business as usual and the requirement. But obviously it's difficult to secure legislative change with, particularly first with Brexit and now responding to the COVID crisis. There hasn't been a lot of capacity within government or willingness to engage with some of these initiatives. And so that's where I think bringing together different businesses, different stakeholders, NGOs, everyone working together to create pressure and try to get that traction is really important. So we're certainly looking to just build the biggest collaborations that we can to try to get that traction. My understanding is that actually some of the pressure for some of the provisions in the Modern Slavery Act, which look at the impact on supply chains, actually came from businesses themselves who were wanting to act responsibly, and those businesses lobbying government saying they didn't want to be at a competitive disadvantage because government initially was unwilling to impose those kind of supply chain reporting obligations on businesses. So I think it would be great to see lots of businesses coming forwards and engaging on these issues.
Brilliant. Well, I hope that picks up some of your questions, Ian, and the sense. And just to go back to checking other questions people have, I think, Jessica, we did talk a little bit about green procurement. So hoping, do you have anything further you want to say about that? So to bring Jess in.
Oh no, I'm fine. Stephanie already messaged me. So yes, we're all good.
Brilliant. Well, I'm really pleased that we can share information and make this, you know, part of you being all part of the network.
Yeah, that's great.
Can I make an observation, just building off what Stephanie was saying? Because I think you can see some really interesting things happening with COVID-19 at the moment and how businesses are responding. And what they're doing is responding in a way in which they can and that suits their business skills. So Dyson is, you know, coming up with a new way to manufacture respiratory equipment. Well, that's fantastic. I mean, we couldn't do that because we're not. So I think, and you know, it's brilliant that Bates Wells, who's an amazing law firm, is using all their legal expertise to tackle in that sort of piece. And the way for us to do it is to try and use our communications expertise. And I think one step of the bravery that people and perhaps a journey that people are going on, and maybe that's where something like Business Declares helps, is by taking an environment declaration out of just environmental policy that sits in one aspect of the business and putting it into the organization as a whole. And that says, okay, fine, we can do all our environmental technical piece, we can do our thing, but what else can we do? Who are we as an organization? What assets and skills and knowledge do we have that is really going to make a bigger difference to accelerate through this? And I think it's something really, it's a helping to push that mindset forwards about how we can use those assets and skills. Sorry, I hope that's helpful.
I think that's really helpful, and you're getting lots of support on the chat around that, and certainly I think that answers some of our questions around what's different, and also helps us in thinking, where do we go now? How do we position things within this planetary crisis in that sense. So are there any more questions that anyone want to come off mute for the last couple of minutes for a question?
Yeah, and I've noticed there's one that we haven't picked up from the chat about offsetting, which is a great question and something that I get asked quite often from clients. And it's basically, what do we think about offsetting? How does that what does that look like as part of a climate plan? And I think it'd be really interesting to hear from Amanda and Stephanie if they use offsetting within their current plans. My sort of position on it is, yes, you might need to do some offsetting, but do it as like the absolute last thing that you're doing. So, you know, you have to look at reaching net zero, potentially going beyond that. It's about reducing your absolute emissions across all your scopes as much as you possibly can. And in the near term, you might need to do some offsetting to kind of get to the right level. But I think it's just kind of the last thing that you should be looking at. And if you do it, make sure it's to a very, very high standard, so that there's a concept of like additionality, so that when whatever you're paying to wherever you're putting that chunk of cash in terms of an offset, it needs to be something that is additional to something that would have already happened without your cash being put into it. And then there's a whole kind of gold standard, it's called, around offsetting, that you can find gold standard offsetting schemes that will guarantee that. That's what I would say. And I think,
great.
Yeah, I don't know if Amanda or Stephanie, I don't know if you use offsetting within your plans, or if you thought about that at all.
Stephanie, is that relevant to you?
There is an element of offsetting in our plan. I will be honest and say I'm not the technical expert on how we're approaching that, other than that obviously the priority is to reduce emissions as much as we can, and on an ongoing basis look for further ways to reduce them. But one of my colleagues said, if you had zero emissions, you know, we wouldn't be breathing. I think probably there's inevitably going to be an element of offsetting. But if anyone is looking into that, what I can do is, if you want to drop me a line, I can connect you with our colleagues who have been focusing on the measurement and the carbon reduction, and what we do about the offsetting aspects of the policy.
Yeah.
Yes, and we're similar. I mean, so I completely back everything that Ellie said around choosing the right type of offsetting, and we're having a look at that. It needs, I think, overall people should be looking at it as a way of a last resort, and perhaps something that's going to get less and less as you get other things in place. So I think it's about seeing the journey and the picture of it as an overall, rather than achieving net zero just by paying some money to offset. That's not the answer.
I agree. And just one last question from Shana in that, what's happening in the collaborative sense in terms of business for the upcoming COP? We're working closely with Steve Waygood at Aviva Investors on what they're calling now the kind of international platform for climate finance. So that is a multi-stakeholder coalition, does lead up to COP. But I know from him that Microsoft, BT, Vodafone, some others are looking into a virtual COP, and the government. So we hope that we will be involved in that. We hope to get businesses working with us on that. But it's going to be a fascinating way to do it. And happy to connect with you afterwards around that. I think we do have a couple more questions around emergency response or business opportunity. And if anybody, I'm not sure on time really. Ellie, have we got time to follow up with one more question?
Yeah, let's go for one more question, and then I was just going to mention what else people can do, and just kind of skip back one slide, because there's a few things that we've got some other events coming up as well.
Can I just pick up on this point around whether it's an emergency response or a business opportunity? I think it's about finding the commonality, and actually in any scenario, and whether it's climate or health or whatever it is, it's about whether it's the right thing to do, and are you doing the most you can? And that sort of sense of narrative. Are you, I mean, with the climate emergency moment, are you going to feel, are you the business leader or the people going to feel proud when you look back at how you responded to that? And ditto, it's the same emotion. Are we doing the same? Are we doing things that can say that, yes, we did what we could? and are we doing the right things, and are we pushing things forward? So I don't think there has to be a conflict in that at all. I think it is about constantly saying, are we as an organisation addressing these really complex issues in the right way, fast enough as we can?
Thank you for that brilliant answer to the question we just had in. I think we're back to you, Ellie, and just to sum up. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so just to say that there's loads of stuff on our website, so go to businessdeclares.com for examples of declarations. You can sign up for the rest of our kind of comms if you're not already signed up for the newsletter. We've got our next webinar. We might do something before this, but the next one we've definitely got in the diary is with On Purpose and Actionable. That was an event that we've shifted to be an online session on the 23rd of April. And other things you can do is obviously get in touch with us if you want any more information. And we also can run kind of 2-hour workshops with your team. So if you need kind of, if you want more sort of detail around specific to your organisation, we've got a kind of climate emergency workshop format that we're looking at taking online at the moment. So we can also do that. Get in touch if you're interested. And thank you so much for your thoughts on our kind of future webinars. And I think we're definitely going to be coming out with some more information on how we can start to sort of convene more thinking around how to respond to the various crises that we're all currently facing. And so, yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to our speakers as well. Thank you, Saf and Amanda and Stephanie. It's fantastic to have you on today. And thank you for joining us, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Great to join you all.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.